Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Paul Bramett. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion Society here at UVic, and I see lots of folks in the waiting room and in the audience whose names I don't recognize. So welcome to the second CSRS Spring Lecture of 2022. Although we normally hold our public lectures on Thursdays at 5 p.m., in the spring we shift to midday slots so people could join us during lunch or before siesta. As always, our lectures give us a chance to showcase the work of our fellows and also, I think, to build bridges between the university and the broader public. We're here today to hear from one of our CSRS graduate student fellows. Isabelle Kostecki is a doctoral student in the joint program of the University of Montreal and the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Prior to entering her PhD program in 2017, Isabelle completed a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Montreal and a BFA in film production at Concordia University in 2009. Among other fellowships and scholarships, she holds a Bombardier doctoral scholarship from SSHRC. She has published articles and chapters or provided scholarly lectures on topics ranging from the religious practices of Quebecois baby boomers, end-of-life rituals, Quebecois converts to Islam, spiritual care at Quebec, and the end-of-life rituals of religious nuns. We were delighted to have her with us in October when we hosted an international workshop on religion, spirituality, and health humanities. And I'm so pleased to have her back with us today to see the convergence of several of the themes on which she has been working for some time now and that interests so many of us here at the CSRS. But before I turn the digital podium over to Isabelle, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Okay, Isabelle, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. It's a beautiful introduction. So I'll be talking today about my doctoral research on end-of-life rituals in healthcare. I would like to start on a very personal note to say it's a very special conference for me because it is the first engagement that I have since my life partner has passed away 4 weeks ago, James. So I am talking to you today from a place of immense grief, and I hope this will add some deeper layer to my message, to my work. And this is also something that we can discuss later on, the merging of the personal experience and the researchers' observations. And I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart, the team at the CSRS, Paul, Rachel, and Scott, who make me feel at ease so I can come as I am and speak from both mind and heart. I'm going to be showing several images throughout my talk, and I would like here to take the opportunity to thank James Roney, who is the artist who did those wonderful illustrations, because I could not record any footage while I was in those deathbed rituals. And incidentally, James Roney is also from Victoria. So this first metaphorical image that I would like to show you, this is a series by a French painter called Pierre Soulages. He's a painter who's quite famous in France and 102 years old. And this series is called Les Outres Noires. It's a very beautiful title. In English, you could translate it as Beyond Black. And for me, this is a metaphor of what I'm trying to do with my work, is looking at death and looking at rituals, trying to see the greater light and the greater life that is reflected into the darkness. And I think it is a profound human imperative to perceive light and life that is greater than death in order to survive in the wake of death. So this is what my research is about, looking at new rituals that have emerged in healthcare around biological death in hospital settings. And how can a sense of hope, continuity beyond death emerge through the ritual experience itself, in particular through the renewal of social bonds, rather than religious dogma. So my topic is new secular models for providing end-of-life rituals. And it has also been my acute experience for the past 4 weeks, finding light in the darkness of James's death without a clear sense of belief in the afterlife, but a willingness to engage with new ways of knowing, feeling, and imagining. So the reason why I focus on spiritual caregivers, it's a new profession that has emerged in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada, French-speaking Switzerland, in Belgium, in Holland, and other countries. It's a new profession for an old occupation of spiritual or religious representative who support the sick and the dying in their spiritual needs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on context because I kind of want to go and do a deep dive into the data, the ethnographic data that I have collected. But I'm just going to quickly tell you about the context in Quebec. So there was a very rapid and recent secularization process that brought an important shift in healthcare institutions from the 1960s. And the most recent turn was basically this shift from chaplains, priests, and pastoral animators to this profession called in French, intervenant en soins spirituels. It's a very bureaucratic term. I find it in English, it's a bit better, spiritual caregiver. So basically, this new profession, they have the status of clinical members. They are part of multi-professional teams, and they use a counseling approach. So they are no longer religious representatives. They don't have a moral agenda in principle. So they operate in interfaith capacity according to a patient-centered approach in service of the worldviews of their patients and providing care in terms of what is meaningful for them. So they use a lot of dialogue and often rituals to help their patients through a meaning-making process of the life cycle, of illness, of death approaching. And they also help them facilitate closure and appeasement, also when there is tensions with their surroundings. Just to mention in terms of their education and their background, so traditionally they were trained in practical theology, but more and more they're trained in religious science in a more multi-faith approach. And their training also incorporates positive psychology, grief counseling, and elements of social work. So there's basically this big shift from religion to spirituality, where spirituality becomes this universal category that reaches across all religious traditions or lack thereof. So there is this notion that even atheistic people would have a spirituality. And there is a pressure on spiritual caregivers to conceptualize spirituality within the biomedical framework and legitimize spirituality in terms of its efficacy with, for example, psychological indicators. So it's quite interesting because spiritual caregivers are crafters of a new spiritual secular tradition in healthcare, following the transformation of dominant modes of religiosity. So this is the challenge that they face, is that how do you reinvent, so to speak, rituals in the age of secularization, when there's a growing number of non-religious people. There's also more and more diversity represented in patients at the hospital with the growth of non-Christians. And in that context, traditional ritual scripts, for example, the sacrament of the sick that is found in Catholicism, are no longer meaningful to a growing number of people. So there is a real necessity, a social necessity for them to be creative and to develop new models for rituals that are not centered on a tradition, but are centered on a participant's experience and what is meaningful to them, as I said before. There is an additional challenge, is that in the context of end-of-life rituals, the ritual is collective. So you're going to have the patient to whom the ritual whose beliefs must be reflected in the ritual, but then you will have many, 3, sometimes 4 generations who don't necessarily have the same set of beliefs. So there's no longer a social consensus to build a ritual upon. There's a real notion of ambivalence, diversity, sometimes tension. So how do you create, when there is no common language to symbolically approach the existential questions that pose death, on what grounds do you build a ritual? That's the sort of the question that I had when I entered the fieldwork. So I conducted an ethnographic study among spiritual caregivers, and I tried to approach the very intimate context of deathbed farewell ceremonies, which was not an easy feat. There were a lot of steps I had to go through, different formalities, and have through with the ethical committees, and show exactly how my research would benefit the practice. And so I started by doing semi-directed interviews with 24 spiritual caregivers in 20 different hospitals in Quebec. And then I did participant observations by shadowing 7 of them. And I managed to observe 15 farewell ceremonies, which was kind of a hunt. It was not easy to catch those moments because they would sometimes happen in the middle of the night, or etc. I was supposed to conduct comparative research between Quebec and the French-speaking part of Switzerland, but because of the pandemic, it was basically aborted. So I chose to instead collect data remotely on rituals that spiritual caregivers in Quebec were conducting in the context of the pandemic. So I'm just going to show you here. This is an example of a ritual that was conducted over the phone for a lady who had lost her mother. And at the peak of the pandemic, as you know, there were no funerals possible. So people were basically floating in some sort of unresolved grief. And this proved to be very problematic. So this spiritual caregiver offered some kind of replacement, some sort of mini intimate ritual in lieu of a funeral for the mother, where basically it was on Mother's Day. And there were many initiatives like that, many rituals that were being conducted remotely during the time of the pandemic. So basically, my research question was very broad and exploratory because my topic has not been researched that much at all, actually. So first question was just to understand what kind of rituals are being conducted today in hospitals in Quebec at the end of life, but also what is the significance of such rituals for dying patients and their families? So in other words, where lies the potency of these rituals? What are the dynamics of their efficacy? So basically, in my analysis, I take into account what spiritual caregivers think, their perspective, what spiritual caregivers do, what I observed, that the practices they have, and then what is the experience like? So I looked at the behavior of participants during rituals, and I also include my subjective experience as a researcher participating in those rituals. I do have a sort of blind spot, which is quite important in this research, is that I did not conduct interviews with the patients and their families. It was not, the scope was becoming too large within this context, and there were many ethical issues in doing that. So this would be something to do eventually to really understand what is the lived-in experience and the impact of those rituals for the families. So what kind of rituals are being conducted? So, I mean, there are many everyday rituals, such as prayers, according to the patient's belief system. Here is an example of a patient who was 90 years old, and he was a little bit confused and disconnected. And they said, oh, let's, his daughter asked for a prayer for him to be performed because he was very devout. And so at that moment, the man sort of rose up, and it was very striking, rose his arms to the sky as if he was in direct contact with his God. So that's just some sort of everyday scenes that will happen in end-of-life care. There is also all sorts of other rituals, communion, rituals of consolation and letting go to anticipate grief, resolve tensions, rituals of heritage, where, for example, over a number of days, the spiritual legacy of the patient will be consolidated in collaboration with his family. There are even emergency baptisms and even marriages that can be done in palliative care. So the rituals that I looked at are farewell ceremonies. Here is an example of a farewell ceremony that was conducted again at the peak of the pandemic. So Most of the family members are actually attending remotely. You can see them there in the iPad. You have the spiritual caregiver on the right, and then only 1 or 2 close ones were allowed. So that was a very difficult situation for the families to be put in, because they had to choose a delegate, and the other ones had to say their goodbyes remotely. This, of course, is an exceptional situation, but I just want to describe a little bit, in general, what do these farewell ceremonies look like? So they happen in the end of life trajectory. So either before, just right before, or shortly after biological death. So it's interesting because these are rites of passage where the symbolical window matches the actual biological window. I'll come back to this idea. So there are rather complex rituals that involve the dying person and the close ones. But most often than not, the dying person is actually unconscious. I think the reason for that is that there is an issue with death and denial of death. And I think families tend to relegate to the very end the acceptance that their loved one is actually dying. And at that moment, it is sometimes too late to have a spiritual caregiver be on call at that moment. The patient is often unconscious. So the spiritual caregivers have heavy time constraints. It means that those rituals are largely improvised. So they have to meet the family and ritualize in one take. There is no preparation virtually. They have to improvise. There is a very modest decorum, no candles allowed. So it's basically just the drab hospital setting, sometimes a few personal symbols. And sometimes the spiritual caregiver will bring in symbolic objects like some butterflies or something like that to use in the ritual, but that's not the norm. So those rituals are more or less recognizable as religious rituals. From what I've seen, most will evoke God and incorporate religious prayers. But the main content of those rituals revolves more and more around the life story of the patient. This is really the basis for the ritual. And informal and intimate interactions is also the basis of those rituals. So because of the immediacy of death, those ceremonies tend to be very solemn, and the emotions are very raw as well. So from the standpoint of the ritual maker, there's a lot to work with. I know it's a weird way of looking at it. So basically, these spiritual caregivers have some kind of model in their mind. It's some sort of ritual generic structure, which can be adapted on a case-by-case basis to reflect the patient's and the family beliefs. And so that means that the ritual model in itself is secular, but it does not exclude religious ritual. It is supposed to support confessional rituals as well as non-confessional rituals. So it's very important, I'll again reiterate, secular ritual models do not exclude religious components. So this is something we can discuss later if you wish. Okay, so now that I've sort of set the context and given you a rough idea, I would like to do a deep dive where I'm going to read out an ethnographic vignette, a thorough description of a ritual, so you kind of get a better sense of what can happen. This is a ritual that I chose because I believe it was very powerful and it had a very big impact, and you're going to see how it unravels. So the names that I'm using are not their real names. This is a ritual for a man that was called Rufus. On a cold and windy morning in December, I'm on duty with Linda, one of the spiritual caregivers that I follow for a few weeks. Her colleagues often refer to Linda as the angel of death. She's a joyful lady in her early 50s with an artistic and social flair. She holds more than 12 years of experience in spiritual counseling and is said to be a ritual conducting virtuoso. I am feeling a great sense of anticipation as we enter the intensive care unit, where she was called for a discontinuation of treatment, referring to letting nature take its due course. It presents the best case scenario for an end-of-life ritual. An imminent death on schedule means the family tends to naturally converge toward taking a collective moment to honor their loved one. We learn from the staff that the patient, Rufus, a Franco-Quebecer in his 50s, is unconscious. He was found in a deteriorated state after major alcohol consumption and subsequent organ failure. The family has been notified that his life support system will be terminated, for nothing can be done to save him. We enter the room where a dozen people congregate around the bed where Rufus lies. He has been intubated and attached to a ventilator and an array of monitors. The room is bathed in sunlight and the family seems relatively calm, though their eyes are filled with dread and confusion. Linda immediately establishes a warm and reassuring connection with the group when introducing herself and explains her role as well as mine. We learn that Rufus has no spouse nor child, but his mother, brother, cousins, nieces and nephews, and their partners are present. Immediately, Linda must simultaneously gather information about the patient's circumstances, the prevailing state of mind of the next of kin, perceive the unsaid, and establish a quality bond built on trust. These initial moments are key in establishing the right tone and common understanding. She offers her most wholesome presence to the room, minding both what she says and, most importantly, how she says it. As intimidating as this human context may be, she is completely at ease, infusing the room with such generosity and reassurance that it feels like she carries the whole family on her shoulders. I take on a silent yet active stance of compassion, becoming the vehicle of warmth and support I believe to be necessary in such situation. Linda seeks to untie their tongues and put their stunned selves back into movement. The brother, a lively leather-laden man, states the family's desire to give a moment of calm and peace to Rufus. His mother sits by his deathbed, stricken with grief. Linda walks to the side of the unconscious patient and with a hand on his shoulder, names herself and her mission to accompany him and his family to the end. She says that they will build the ritual together and asks the family to tell her about Rufus and share memories they hold dear. And so begins the ritual. We hear an anecdote of a boot that was too big. The family comes to life. We learn that alcohol was a problem, his health was poor, and that he had attempted multiple times to take his life. Linda reflects that Rufus was a wounded man who had suffered continuously. We learn that he had trouble communicating his love to his family and that he did not want to be a burden. He would sometimes call drunk late at night or send them songs. Elvis Presley's My Way was one of his favorites. It defined him. After validating that Rufus's mother is a believer, Linda conveys in an address to God what has been said about Rufus, underlying his turmoil and sufferance. Looking at his 80-year-old mother, she says that God is all merciful, that the suffering has ended, and that Rufus can rest now. The mother nods and weeps. She then invites the family to move with all the emotions they may be feeling for a time of suffering. For a time of offering, not suffering, a time of offering. She suggests we now nurse Rufus with the song My Way. She finds the song on her iPhone's YouTube app. We gather around the deathbed as we would a cradle, and Linda puts her iPhone playing the piece next to Rufus's ear. She says this song embodies his last words. Everyone is immediately brought to tears. Rufus's closest brother weeps loudly and holds his hand. Others touch Rufus's feet, arms, chest, hands, and head. The emotional charge is one of the highest I have ever experienced collectively. At the end of the song, there is a migration away from the bed towards boxes of tissues and deep breaths of fresh air. Linda continues on behalf of God's mercifulness. She says, "For those who know this word, it reminds us that we cannot imagine the greatness of his love. Looking at the mother, she proposes to recite the Our Father prayer, and that we will say it all together in the name of the family ties. Moving back towards the bed, more than half recite the prayer with familiarity and with a more contained emotional effusion. Echoing the last verse, but deliver us from evil, Linda adds, what this means is that yes, we may have done evil, but furthermore, the greatest evil is to be unable to receive love. May God deliver Rufus of that evil and let him receive love. I sense so much love circulating amongst you. This seems to strike an important chord for the family, who react with cries and exhales of relief. Next, Linda proposes a moment for each person to approach the patient and give him a wish or benediction, or make a gesture that is personally meaningful. She makes the sign of the cross on his forehead. The family members follow one by one, whispering in his ear, giving a kiss, a hug, or also drawing a sign of the cross. In the final moment, Linda offers the family a song she delivers a cappella, in a clear, naked, slightly trembling voice. It is a popular Quebecois song called You Will Find Peace in Your Heart, that lingers on the words tranquility, great rest, stillness. The effect of her singing is soothing, as if clearing the air and performing the very meaning of the words. The family members receive the song unblinking. It is the final gift of the spiritual caregiver. The ritual ends, and Linda wraps up with a final comment concerning the continued presence of Rufus after his death in their lives, and that they might need time to recognize his transformed presence within themselves. She tells the mother and the brother that she is available to them. As she bids them farewell, she receives a tremendous amount of gratitude, clearly expressed by each family member. I am surprised to receive a significant amount of attention and gratitude as well, despite having done very little. We wish them courage and say we will be thinking of them. We leave the room, making way for the medical team to prepare the cessation of Rufus's life support system. Can I just ask how much time is left?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to give you a condensed summary of what I'm trying to get at with my thesis and the analysis that I'm making of those rituals. So the idea that I'm working with, basically, to explain why rituals are powerful or not, is the extent to which they enact relational constellations, like a web of relationships, and the extent to which this web of relationships is animated by what I call the gift dynamic, a dynamic of gift that is circulating. So I draw on the relational theory of anthropologist Michael Hausman, who states that fundamentally rituals enact complex networks of relationships between human entities, non-human entities, metaphysical entities, and symbols. So it's very useful, this theory, to approach secular ritual models that don't rely on religious scripts. So this relationship constellation is very apparent in this ritual for Rufus. It binds in intricate and experiential ways the family members, the dying, the spiritual caregiver herself as the mediator of all those relationships, Elvis, who appears like some sort of mythological creature, God, and symbolic references like the prayer and the song. So they all refer to one another. Sometimes they refer for one another throughout the ritual. Like, for example, when she lends Elvis's voice to be the voice of their dying loved one. So, and going further, we can see that there is a gift pattern in the relation that are occurring. So all bonds are being formed through the circulation of a gift, an offering, or an altruistic action or intention. So the notion of the gift dynamic, you've probably heard of it, is inspired by the theory of French sociologist and anthropologist Marcel Mauss. So it basically states that the gift exchange, comprising a cycle of giving, receiving, and reciprocating, is a core mechanism to understand how human bonds are formed and renewed. So this is how basically solidarity is built in groups, and it's very apparent and very dense in rituals. So I'm not going to spend too much time rereading the whole, I think it's pretty apparent, but I'm just going to give a few examples of how there is this gift circulating in a web of relationships. So first of all, the family wants to gift a moment of calm and tranquility to their loved one. There is this explicit intention to make gift, right? And so the spiritual caregiver responds with her wholesome presence and guidance for the ritual. There's also this idea that the dead, by sheer virtue of being dying, I mean, gives a gift. By being near death, he induces the stripping away of certain parts of social identities and the emerging of the authentic selves and what really matters. So throughout the ritual, all the invitations that are formulated by Linda are framed like offerings, such as nursing Elvis and offering our stories, offering our gratitude, etc. It's interesting to see that she even recites the Our Father prayer. She says, let's recite it in the name of family ties and for the grieving mother who is attached to the Christian religion. So that means that even those who are not believers can find new meaning in reciting the prayer, not as an act of faith, but as an act of solidarity. So there are very interesting dynamics going on there. There's a lot of levels. So as the ritual progresses, the emotional and symbolic arc intensify with several high points. And so the ritual, so to speak, picks up when there is a sentiment of greater forces coming into play and the sense of partaking in something great and mystical and sacred. So this culmination is related to the accumulation of gifts or affective energy that Linda refers to as the abundance of love and the progressive revelation of what Victor Turner, the anthropologist, would call an essential and generic human bond. The ritual finds closure when family members express genuine outward display of gratitude, not mere thank yous demanded by social convention. So the gratitude is the token that the gifts were well received. So in my thesis, I basically try to show that partaking in such relational ritual experiences potentially opens possibilities of hope in the face of death, even strengthening or reactivating some type of faith, or at least the notion of a life being greater than death. I'm aware that it sounds a little bit poetic and not the most, anyway, now I would like to bring in my most recent personal experience and my involvement with James's ritual process and show how basically this framework works for all kinds of rituals, really. All kinds of rituals surrounding death, loss, and bereavement can be understood by this idea of relational constellations being animated by gifts circulating. So the process of surviving loss by finding light and a life greater than death is inherently relational. And that is because bereavement means that death deprives. And it is the natural order of things that attachment inevitably leads to suffering and a void when the relationship is ruptured. So in a way, loving can only expose oneself to loss and grieving sooner or later. So love calls loss, but loss also calls love. And this I have been experimenting very, very acutely. So that means that one is deeply affected by loss. The possibility of survival is proportional to the amounts of gifts of the heart offered in compensation by those around us. So we can see this at a purely energetic level. It is as if the void calls to be filled again, yearning towards a state of homeostasis in a way. The void must be filled with gifts of the heart and of an altruistic spirit. We must receive loving kindness, empathy, compassion, and presence in order to survive death. And in the face of powerlessness, Humans do spontaneously come forward in an attempt to fill the void. It can take the form of small offerings, messages, phone calls, hugs, or roasted lasagna to signify care or presence. But as I tried to show, there's nothing more powerful than full-fledged rituals to activate their circulation of spiritual gifts. And this framework has inspired me personally in the process of trying to give due ritual honors to James. If I have just a bit of time, I'm going to share something that I did for him. So, because James had died so young and abruptly at the age of 36, I was very concerned with his spiritual welfare, filled with notions that he may not be at peace or may linger not far from earthly life, concerned with the immense sorrow his departure had created in us. So I was determined to conduct a ritual solely dedicated to his spiritual welfare at the time of the cremation of his body. That was 3 Tuesdays ago. Driven by the imperative to appease him and help him go in peace, I think most people understood my initiative as my personal way of coping, doing what I needed in the context of my own grief. But for me, the intention was mustered towards James and the subjectivity of his soul. So I went with one of his best friends to the crematorium to perform this short ritual to accompany James's body before the flames, a ritual inspired by the Hindu or yogic tradition with the gifting of a flower, a last drink of holy water, and the chanting of a mantra for release, serenity, and encouragement to continue his journey. This demanded mighty courage on my part, but I was met with a sense of relief of having done the right thing by James as far as my ability. I thought I might have overstepped my role, but James's loved ones wanted to know about it, and they said they were thankful that I had gone, that I had been present. So this made me fully realize once more the intricate ways that us who love James are related in his death, with this idea that the intention I had embodied, a reparative energy for James, had been received by his close one too. Hearing how this ritual had mattered to those who love him was the greatest gift I could have in turn received at that moment. So the effect of the ritual, the circulation of a gift of care and love, moves in ripples and circles, and rituals and intentional acts matter for those who are present and those who are absent, those who are active and those who are passive, for gifts of the heart circulate. So if I may, I would like to provide some concluding remarks, which are very different than what I would usually say in a conference. I would like to reiterate the importance of understanding dying, grieving, and ritual processes as inherently communal, relational undertakings. We must go beyond psychological notions of individual coping and move along a trajectory of personal healing. Sure, this must take place, but fundamentally, we must remind ourselves and inform our practices that we shall do all those things together. In a community woven in a complex web, linking earthly beings, symbolic entities, as well as spiritual ones. When ritualizing around death, one should remember there are many relationships to animate or renew, and this is best done by enacting altruistic intentions with simplicity, sincerity, and attention. Those suffering the greatest loss can find life again through receiving gifts of care, affection, love, solicitude. For the bereaved, such gifts reflect the social recognition of their pain, recognition which in turn allows the bereaved to reciprocate those gifts in a chain of mutuality and solidarity, the most important and essential thing we have as humans. All that truly matters in the end. Okay, now I hope I'm not going to cry. To finish, I'd just like to show you James's photo. James Harrington, I'm the love of my life. And so the idea of providing others with gift of the spirit and gifts of the heart is James's legacy to me, because he was so exceptionally generous and pure in this way during his life. And that is in big part how I will maintain continued bonds with him through my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. Maybe you can just stop sharing so we can have the bigger screen.
Yeah, just 1 second. sorry, my mouse is like on my monitor.
Mhm. Scott might be able to stop it for you.
I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, here he goes.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank you. Before we begin the question period, I just want to thank you for that. When we learned about James's death about a month ago, of course, we were terribly sad for you, but also wanted to make sure you felt entirely comfortable simply bowing out, and which would have been 100% understandable. I can't even imagine what you had to summon to do this, so thank you. And you did a fantastic job on an intellectual level, but also in integrating the personal experiential with that intellectual. So thank you. So Anna, we'll turn to the first question. I think maybe Scott has to allow people to speak. I think, Scott, we're okay with this group.
Thank you. Two questions, if I could. You said you left the room. You and Linda left the room and let the medical professionals do their thing, come in and do their thing. Was that the family left as well, or just the two of you?
Just the two of us.
Okay. And then is there like ongoing, like does the family come out of the room and are they held in any way?
Yes, so basically, you have to understand that resources in spiritual care are so limited. They are running from hospital to hospital. In a hospital, you would get 100 psychologists in a ratio of 2 spiritual caregivers. So you have to take that into account in their capacity to surround families. So sometimes, yes, they will come back and host a little closure of dialogue in the little living room space for them. Sometimes it's not possible. So unfortunately, it's very sort of fragmented and it's not seamlessly integrated with the rest of the end of life care.
Right. Have you had any experience with medical assistants in dying?
So
rituals for those?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I gathered data through interviews, but I have not observed myself end of life rituals. But it is definitely actually a very opportunity for spiritual caregivers to develop their craft, because this is where they're more than ever recognized by doctors and nurses in their contribution, because now they can see that there is such a heightened sense of emotional distress and also some sort of spiritual chaos in terms of the meaning of it all, that more than ever they are spiritual caregivers are being called by doctors and nurses, which is not necessarily the case. There is an issue of them being recognized in the workplace. So it's an opportunity for them to develop end-of-life rituals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Good question. David and then Mary Louise. Oh, David, you need to be unmuted.
Hi. Wow, thank you very much, Isabelle, for sharing this and how close it is to you, as well as your chosen field of study. And I just wanted to thank you for that. And this just showed up on my Facebook feed. I'm in the NIMO. I'm 73 years old. I've lost 2 childhood friends my age in the last month, which affected one of them I hadn't seen for 30 years or so. And it was amazing how that bond, affected me emotionally. Then, like literally, I'm on my way. I'm gonna for about 1 o'clock to see a friend who I had lunch with last week at his place. He's over 90 years old. He's 90. He'll be 91. He would have been 91 in August. But he, I just found out he hadn't called me. I was arranging for our almost weekly lunch date we have, and he didn't call me back after a couple of days. And I find out that he's now in palliative care. So I just this is somehow very appropriate for me, and I've also been wondering, I'm 73, and what the next thing I'm going to be up to in my life amongst my various things. But one of them was getting involved in hospice volunteering. So this has sort of pushed me in that direction, and I wondered what your experience was with hospice workers and hospice volunteers in this.
Mhm.
The other thing is I'm involved with men's work, and there's a fair bit of ritual come through with that, like drumming and things like that. So you can comment about that.
Thanks, David.
Well, just for the hospice context question, that is a very particular culture, the hospice culture. It's there's possibilities in terms of accompaniment and rituals that way more comprehensive. You can do way more. It's very different than what I've studied, which was really the hospital context. So that is something that I would like to explore more. And but I have some colleagues who have studied hospice palliative institutions, and they were surprised by the lack of rituals that were being conducted in a sense of farewell ceremonies, for example. There's a lot of little micro rituals integrated in acts of care, like, the cleaning of the body and presence, and maybe a little bit of music played here and there. But it seems as if there is still a need to sort of train, I think, healthcare workers and even palliative care workers in terms of, full-fledged ritual making, the way that those spiritual caregivers have. Not many people in healthcare have this kind of skills, I think. So I think there's a lot of emergence in this topic of rituals surrounding end-of-life care.
Thanks, Isabelle.
Yeah.
Mary Louise, Meg, and then Joel and Daniel. We've got lots of great questions.
First of all, Isabelle, I wanted to thank you for this very thoughtful presentation. I am a former healthcare chaplain, and I remember the most meaningful experiences I had were working in an end-stage respiratory unit for a couple of years in Toronto. And I was used to working collaboratively all the time with social workers. And we called it then interfaith care or multi-faith care, because it made no difference whether a person had a particular background or not. But yes, everything you've pointed to in terms of being responsive to the narrative, the history of any given patient, and I had the rich opportunity at that point to be able to visit with people and learn their stories. Most immediately, it happens that today I am preparing a final ritual for a woman whom I helped with medical assistance in dying in my seniors residence. And this happened to be in December. She was a woman in her 90s who had no family here. A relative from England came over to be with her during her last days in hospital, but she wanted to die here in her home. And I put together with support from others here, some lovely, or what I feel was meaningful to her, because I worked with her. I helped her write her obituary. I helped her deal with her memories. I was the one whom when she wondered about having medical assistance and dying, I said, "Have you spoken with your physician about this?" "Well, no." And I said, "Well, ethically, you need to make that request if this is what you wish to do." So it was holding her hand all the way through this in a way. And on Tuesday, we're going to, a few of her friends are getting together, and we're going to scatter her ashes. I am now in the process of drafting and creating a ritual.
Interesting.
I know some of her stories, so I'm creating a ritual now for this. So I love the sense of these spiritual caregivers, and I love the way in which you offered what I did not know in my chaplaincy training. I did not have the sociological terminology that you were able to frame, and the resources you were able to frame this with. And I'm really greatly appreciative of everything that you are contributing to those of us, particularly those of us who have our are of a certain age.
Thanks, Mary Louise. Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
saying
much, Mary
that.
Louise. Mary Louise is in her early 60s, and so she's,
Oh,
starting to
yeah.
think about these things.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much, Mary Louise.
Throw a
Thanks.
couple decades onto that.
I don't know, Isabelle, if you want to reflect on that, or we can go to Meg's question.
Yeah, there would be a lot of stuff to say. I mean, I'd like to make myself available to you if you would like to get in touch separately from this and discuss about the organization of this ritual, the concept, the design of it. I'd be super interested to if you want.
Yeah, we can connect. Mary Louise is a pillar of the center, so we can definitely connect the two of you.
Perfect.
Thanks. Meg, then Joel.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your work and for sharing it. It's so deeply impactful and important. I work as a social worker in both in acute and in long-term care settings, and the significance of and really the under-resourced, I heard you speak to that, but like the lack of spiritual support in that system is quite it's felt. It's definitely felt. And I'm curious if and what conversations might have surfaced or your thoughts in in ways of bridging that in I don't know, are there like ways of how does one advocate for more of this, or what sorts of other ways kind of pop up? Like I do think of how I see, like we see nurses filling these roles and social workers filling these roles, and folks who are already, spread thin in terms of workloads. And just wondering if there's any thoughts. Are you seeing it increasing? Is there hope for more attention and resource given to these areas, or what conversations are being had in that regard?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a mistake to want to confine the spiritual scales to this single profession. I think actually rituals and spiritual accompaniment should be sort of spread out to varying degrees of skills and know-hows to like a great number of healthcare professionals. I think social workers should be doing a bit of spiritual care, nurses should be doing a bit of spiritual care. I know a lot of spiritual caregivers are not going to agree with me right now because they're in the process of getting recognized. The last thing they want is for me to say, well, anyone can do spiritual care. That's not what I mean. I do think there is there is a danger of putting things in specialized silos. The way that I can't remember your name at the beginning said, so you left and then they came over, the medical staff came over as if it was a separate care, the medical part and the spiritual care part, instead of it being integrated. It is kind of shocking, and at some point I gave a conference, like a training to nurses in Paris, which I was not very familiar with how spiritual care is integrated in France, in French hospitals. And it was very interesting because they were basically sort of offended, saying like, we want to be part of it too, like we are concerned with the spiritual dimension, and they were in pediatric palliative care, so imagine they are dealing constantly with parents and questions of meaning and questions of wanting. And so I think there is this idea that spiritual care would be part of a holistic approach to care, and it should be kind of, I think nurses, social workers, psychologists, etc., should all sort of get trained and be sensitized to the importance of spiritual care and this dimension in the care. So this is also what I plan on doing, because I hadn't thought about my work like that. At first, I was just okay, I'm going to focus on the skills of like actual spiritual caregiver, like practitioners. But then I realized, no, that's a mistake. I have to open it up, to maybe a degree less sophisticated or like more basic, but also offer a training on like how to propose rituals to all kinds of different healthcare professions. That's where I'm at now in terms of it. Yeah.
Isabelle, and perhaps we can tease this out tomorrow, but one of the interesting features of Meg's question is the observation that there's this kind of, tension among different professionals in a hospital setting about who does what, who's paid for what, who is expected to do what, who's recognized for what types of skills, and like there's always this jockeying, right? And I think that's a very live tension, and as healthcare dollars are always so So much up for grabs that everybody wants to say, well, our people do that, social workers, nurses, chaplains, and it's so tricky to find the boundaries.
It is. Yeah, it's a huge issue for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Joel, then Daniel.
Isabelle, thanks for your presentation. Thanks for your vulnerability, and sorry to hear about your loss in the last month as well. As you were sharing, I was thinking a lot about a recent book titled The Lost Art of Dying, and they talk about community and rituals and various points of resonance. My question is, relative to this farewell ceremony, any sense of whether there were other rituals leading up to that in the weeks, months, or even years, as perhaps for some the longer process of dying, perhaps? Was this final farewell ritual an extension of or connected to a series of other rituals or a standalone ritual? Any sense or comments on that?
Okay, well, I can't talk for the particular case study that I presented, but in general, I think there is this awareness that ritual should be thought about as a process, and the more encompassing and the longer the time period cover, the more powerful. There's a lot of, like, if you imagine a trajectory from, like, let's say hospitalization, learning to live with illness, okay, approaching decline, to finally getting to the moment of biological death, followed by social death. Like, dying is this like long, it's not an event, it's not even a series of events, it's really this process. And ideally there should be like rituals sort of integrated through it all out. And I've seen, I know that there are some chaplains in Holland, and I read also some works of the chaplains based in Iceland, where they seem to have a bit more leeway in their institutional context to kind of do some initiatives within the walls of the hospital and outside the walls of the hospital. The problem is that when you have the walls, institutional walls, that artificially sort of cut up with the possible initiatives, it doesn't match with the lived reality that the dying person goes through and their family goes through. And as was said before, like sometimes in the ritual process, there's going to be very practical issues related to a testament, related to or spiritual legacy, related to appeasing conflicts in the family. So you see, there is no clear-cut boundaries between like social work and psychology and spiritual care. So this is what I see would be like a good area of development, hopefully, to make care and more human, and not artificially sort of divided. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks, Joel. Daniel, and then Estraven.
Hi, yeah, I was struck by the real difference between your tale of Linda, the spiritual assistant, and my experience at my sister-in-law's maid passing, in that it's part of the maid process that the ritual is going to include the actual cessation of life, the moment of death. Whereas your description, the actual moment of death occurred after the ritual. And then we have the whole issue that seems to be raising itself lately of the dying person expressing a wish not to have any ritual at all after passing. And so there seems to be a real broad spectrum from the importance of being there at the actual moment of death to a wish to deny the survivors the opportunity to have that ritual. I wonder if you could comment on those sort of disparate notions.
Yeah, there's so many situations. Like I've attended some end-of-life rituals where we actually stayed in the room. So there was not this clear-cut, exiting. But when the medical staff came in, they sort of took over the scene. And so the actual moment of death, in that case, it was also termination of treatment. So it involves like the actual mechanical movements to suspend the life system. It's as if the spiritual caregiver in that moment had lost his status as a leader. He was just like an accompaniment, guidance, support role. So I think this is what tends to happen a lot, maybe in a hospital setting. I don't, I have a limited view also what happens in the field in general. I think there's a lot of different scenarios, but it also depends according to the type of death, because there are so many factors that come into account. You know, what kind of death is it? Is it a death on schedule, or is it some kind of slow death which you can sort of see coming? And in that, so I mean, yeah, I'm not giving a very clear answer, but that's what I can come up with for now. The second thing you touched upon was, oh, the wishes for after. I'm not sure I understand your question.
A number of occasions with people that I have known who have passed away over the last couple of years has involved the dying person expressing a wish that there not be a funeral and or a celebration of death, a celebration of life, I should say. And you know, I would think that this would be sort of antithetical to the import that you're ascribing to ritual.
Okay, yeah, I get it. So I think there's now this tendency to want to stay very much focused on life and not give preoccupation to the actual spiritual farewell and the spiritual becoming of the soul. This is like a clear observation in like contemporary rituals, that there is this sort of focusing either on life, and as you said, now funerals are often called celebrations of life. So I mean, as an anthropologist, looking at like all the different functions that should be or are usually fulfilled by death rituals in other cultures, or there is a big gap there if we are just focusing on the life and not having a collective discourse and collective meaning making about what happens after that. So I mean, I would say that's problematic, you know, because it leaves people having to solve this question on their own individually, and there's no longer a collective space to do it. And it is problematic, in my opinion.
Thanks, Isabelle. I'm just mindful of, we're a couple minutes over our normal end of the conversation, and yet this is such a rich conversation. There have been some hands up of center fellows, and so Catherine, if you want to join us tomorrow, or you can ask your question today if you're not able to come tomorrow. And for those of the rest of you who still want to continue this conversation, I've put in the chat the address of Noriko, who's our administrative assistant. If you want the link for tomorrow's coffee talk, which is where we kind of tease out some of the conversations that we started today, Noriko can share that with you. You just need to contact her and tell her that I said it was okay. And so, yeah, Straven is going to rejoin us tomorrow, hopefully with their daughter too. And Catherine, do you want to join us tomorrow, or would you like to do it now?
I'm going to try to join tomorrow. I have a conflict, but let's save the question, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. So Isabelle, as you can tell from the number of questions you received, there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I really appreciate, again, you know, what you were able to muster to be with us today and to be with us so fully intellectually as well as emotionally. Thanks so much also for the great questions. I'd love to see some of you tomorrow at our center coffee talk. This is normally reserved for research fellows at the center, but actually I think the level of questions we had was so good that some of you would be very welcome to come back. It's on Zoom, so if you want the link, we can do that. If you want a sense of what's happening next week, actually Catherine Young, who has kindly offered to give her question tomorrow, is giving the lecture next week, same time, same Zoom place, and it'll be a wonderful talk, as Catherine's talks always are. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good week. See some of you tomorrow and some of you next week at Catherine's talk. All right, everyone, take care. Thanks again, Isabelle.
Bye.